My name is Emily Lowe. My husband is Ryan. Our son is Wyatt. He's 4 years old. And our daughter, Maggie Rose, is forever 8 days old. In 2015, we found out that we were expecting our second child. We were preparing for her birth, all excited about all the newborn things that you're preparing for, when we found out that Maggie was actually going to be born with only half of a heart, and it was going to cause a lot of complications. So we started preparing for hospital stays and meeting with surgeons and things like that. And I decided then that no matter how much preparation we were going to do, there's no way we were going to be prepared, and that I was going to commit to following God's word and will, but little did I know how much was actually going to be expected of me. After only 2 more months, Maggie came into this world, but she was born not alive. And it took 12 minutes for the neonatal team to get a heartbeat. But it was a miracle that that happened, because God gave my daughter a gift of life for the second time. So 8 glorious, wonderful days later, we actually found out that Maggie's heart was beyond any saving, that there was no earthly fix that could be done for her. And this came as a very big blow to us, because it's not at all what we were expecting prenatally and not what we had planned for. So at 2:30 p.m. on Wednesday, December 2nd, 2015, I was holding Maggie in my right arm and Ryan was sitting at my side. I was singing Silent Night to her, and as I spoke the words, "Sleep in heavenly peace," Maggie passed from my arms into Jesus's. In the weeks and months that followed, I felt very alone. I had family and friends around me, my church family, but no one could truly understand what I was going through. I went to the hospital with these plans and I came home with empty arms, and I felt like there was no one that could understand that. I had asked and prayed for a daughter and a second child, and we were given that, but then we had to give her back. And I didn't know what was going to happen if I tried to start that conversation again. So it took quite a while for me to be able to open myself up again, and I did that by just praying to God, "What's next, God? What do you have for me?" And I didn't know what was going to happen, but a lot of opportunities came my way where I was able to meet with other people that knew what was going on and could understand me some. And God sent his son to earth for the purpose of dying a horrible, painful death. He knows what it feels like to watch your child die. When nobody else around me could know how I was feeling, God knew. And I just completely realized that Jesus coming to earth and dying, he did that for me. He did that for Maggie. He did it to save us. It's not something that just happened randomly. It was in God's plan, and I didn't know God's plan, but he knows all the plans he has for us. With everything that's happened in the last 17 months, I had no idea how I was going to come back to the place where I was before we found out Maggie's diagnosis. I say now that I'm a different person than I was then. I've changed a lot. I know who holds my daughter every day until I'm able to hold her again in my arms. I know that what is waiting for me when I die, that death is not the end, but rather it's the beginning of eternity. And I'm not going to turn my back on my Father who holds my daughter.
I'm so thankful that Emily is brave in sharing that story, and I've been blessed to be able to sort of, I guess, have a seat in the midst of that and seeing your family here. Thank you all for being here as well. It's a powerful story. It's a difficult one. You know, if you are a parent in here and you hear that story, there's no way your heart is not pierced, really, with the pain of that possibility, or perhaps even you've been through something somewhat like that, and you know all too well what that pain feels like. And I think the thing that comes to my mind I think it's why it's so appropriate that Emily's story lands on today, is this unfairness that I feel. When something happens and you take a step back and you're like, this doesn't even make sense. Like God, why did this happen? Why would you allow this to happen? And it's sort of maybe a subplot to that. If we're being honest with each other, there is this secret formula we live by that we don't always acknowledge, but in our minds we feel like that if we're being good, if we're doing good, if we're striving for goodness, that it should result in goodness, that our circumstances should also be good. And I think it's when tough storms come our way, when painful experiences happen, and they happen in the midst of something where it doesn't make sense, where we can't even put the formula together. It's like, but I've been doing this, and this was happening, and I was striving for this, and God, I was worshiping you, and I was trusting in you, and I was obeying you, and I was trying to be good. Why does this happen? This makes no sense. It's not fair. And if we're being honest with ourselves, that's where we park sometimes. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. One thing I've learned from reading the Bible is God's big enough to handle that. We can sometimes shake our fists, whether it be in anger or in misunderstanding or our outcry for the injustice we've experienced. God already knows we feel that way. So it's good to be real with Him. But I don't believe He wants us to park there for the rest of our lives either. And one of the reasons why I really want to share this biblical comeback story, we've been looking at different people in the Bible that have also had a comeback. I'm really excited about speaking to you guys today about someone that was a lot different than the first two we talked about. When we talked about Samson, Samson was just one of those guys you're like, once you read his whole story, you're just shaking your head like, wow, dude, like you are a little bit of a, yeah, you're just thinking about yourself all the time, and you're missing the point here. But it was not too late for him. And in the end, even with all that he had been through, he chose to do the right thing for God and was a hero of the faith. Last week we talked about David and Bathsheba. David, a man after God's own heart, the best king that ever ruled Israel, the one who really brought Israel to the greatest empire, the pinnacle of its entire history, and yet he committed such great atrocities that it would end up on a Dateline special here. That bad. He would have been impeached for what he did. Literally committing adultery, having the husband murdered, trying to cover it up. It was horrible. And yet we learned last week that it's never too late to come clean. And that when you give all that over to God and you be real in that moment and you choose to take a next step towards God no matter what you've been through, that He will change you. He will do something in you. But maybe you've been sitting here for the past few weeks, if you've been coming saying, man, I don't have a comeback story like that. Like I don't have this story of a jaded past or skeletons in my closet. Or maybe if you're being honest, you're like, well, we all have skeletons in our closet, but mine's just a baby skeleton. Not that big of a skeleton. Like if I were to share my comeback story, everybody would be like, oh, yeah, thanks. Maybe that's how you feel. I've been hearing people say that. Like, I don't know if I have a story like that. Well, maybe your stories will be a little bit more like Joseph's story. Not the Joseph of Christmas, but the Joseph in the Old Testament. And we're going to look in just a few moments in Genesis 45, just the first 15 verses of that chapter. But that's kind of near the end of his historical account. His story begins in Genesis 37. And what you find out is here's a guy who needed a comeback, and he's a good guy. But let me put a pause button on that for just a moment. If we're going to get really theological for just a moment, the Bible is very clear that really none of us are good. And sometimes that helps. It doesn't sound helpful, right? You're no good, none of you. But the Bible says that. And I think the reason it teaches that is to remind us that we tend to operate as if our goodness should result in good outcomes, good circumstances. It just doesn't work that way. I've lived long enough now to where the best of the best, the people who are the least deserving of bad things, sometimes get some of the worst things. And it doesn't make sense in our little formula of goodness should equal goodness. But it just doesn't work out that way. And so here you go with a guy named Joseph who was squeaky clean but needed a comeback because bad things happened in his life. that seemed to come out of nowhere, that seemed to not make any sense. Well, there's a little sense to make out of it. I want to say this. As we look at the beginning of the story, there's a few things. He's a squeaky clean guy. You're not going to find a rap sheet on Joseph. He was a good guy, very obedient, very talented, very used of God, a strong leader, had amazing gifts that God used for his glory. But there are a few things you must understand about him. First of all, he was a bona fide, card-carrying tattletale. He was. And some of you are like, oh, okay, now I don't like this guy already because you were the victim of the tattletale in your house growing up, maybe. I don't know. He was not only a tattletale, he was Daddy's favorite. And the thing that continues to surprise me in the Bible when you read the accounts of these people in the Bible, good, holy people, they would have a favorite child and they didn't even try to hide it. It was not subtle at all. I mean, at least you all hide it a little bit when it's your all's favorites. I mean, because you all still have favorites. But you hide it and get it a little subtle. Everybody's like, well, who is it, me? Is it you? But they didn't hide it at all. Jacob, Joseph's dad, made him a special, multicolored, I like to think of it as very fluorescent, coat to wear. And it was very obvious as Joseph traipsed around in his beautiful coat that Daddy made just for him that he was his favorite. Everybody, this was not debatable. All the brothers agreed, that's the favorite. He is the favorite. So in addition to that, probably the real straw that broke the camel's back for Joseph is that he was a dreamer. He was a dreamer. And he shared his dreams. And God gave him the ability to interpret those dreams. And I believe his downfall began when he was just super honest with his brothers and shared this dream. I had this great dream. Let me tell you about it. He told him the dream and he said, and God gave me the interpretation of the dream. And here's the interpretation of the dream. The day will come when all of you, my brothers, will bow down to me. The end. Good talk, guys. We'll see you. You know? And this was Joseph. He was being honest, he was being real, he was being obedient, he was a great guy, he was a good guy. But you can kind of see what was probably about to cause him some bad circumstances. It says that one day, Jacob, the dad, sent Joseph to go check on his brothers and come back with a report. That happens. His dad was getting him to tattle on them, just to check on them. Well, as he was coming, it says, as they saw him coming from afar, and the reason they can see him coming from afar is because he was wearing what? Daddy's special coat that he made just for him, very multicolored. I just kind of picture them being out in this great plain. It was somewhat desert, but some grass too, because they did have flocks. And you know, if you've seen in the movies when it shows out in the distance and it's hot and there's those heat waves that sort of blur what's in the distance. But in the distance you can see this little dot of great fluorescent color. And they look at each other and say, oh, here comes little Joey. Daddy's favorite. But it turned bad. Not only, I mean, they probably said that a lot, but it turned really bad. They began to talk about how much they didn't like him. They began to talk about how much they hated him. And then they decided they would like to kill him. And if it weren't for a couple of brothers speaking up and saying, okay, let's hold our roll for just a little bit, guys, they came to a compromise and decided to instead to throw him in a well. At least they didn't kill him. And then they realized they could make money off this deal, and they decided instead to sell him to some slaves that happened to be coming by in their camels. Midianites. Those Midianites realized they could make money off this deal. They sold Joseph to a guy named Potiphar. He is the captain of the palace guard for Pharaoh in Egypt. So this sweet, kind boy, Joseph, I'm still saying he's a great guy. You may not have liked him if you were brought up and were told on a lot and you had that one sibling that was like him. You may be like, I don't know how good this guy really is. He really is a great guy. Very obedient, very gifted, a good leader. And yet he's cast into a pit and then sold into slavery. And then once he was there, though, he used his talents. He remained who he was. And Potiphar saw something very great in him. In very quick timing, Joseph was raised up and promoted in that palace to be in charge of everything Potiphar was in charge of. Potiphar basically gave him the keys to the kingdom and said, you're the man. I don't even have to think about anything. You're in charge. He had that much trust in Joseph. But there was a problem. Potiphar's wife got a crush on Joseph. And she was a very seductive woman. She wanted Joseph. So it seemed like daily she was trying to seduce Joseph. Joseph, again, a man of high integrity, of high character, avoided her. But one time, she literally got a hold of his cloak and was trying to pull him into her bedroom and was seducing him. The Bible says, I always picture this as so funny. I picture him running away from her, but he can't get away because she's got her cloak because she's super strong that way, right? And so, but he literally takes his body out of the cloak and runs away, leaving her holding his cloak. I like to think of it as a hoodie, holding that cloak in her hand. She was so angry that her plot for seduction did not succeed that she used it against Joseph. And when Potiphar, her husband, came home, said, this guy Joseph that you trust in so much, look what he did. He came into my bedroom. He came on to me. And look, he left this. I was screaming. So Potiphar, believing everything he was told, like any good husband would do, threw him in jail. And he had done nothing wrong. He'd done everything right, was faithful, man of high integrity, high character, a good leader, and he ends up in jail instead. But the Bible says Joseph kept just being Joseph. And so he ended up raising up in the ranks, and the warden of that prison put him in charge of the prison, even though he was a prisoner. He was in charge of the prison. So that's pretty cool. And at some point, Pharaoh threw his cupbearer and his baker into that same prison. And they had dreams. And Joseph's like, I can interpret dreams. God, give me the ability to interpret them. So he goes to the cupbearer and says, here's what your dream means. In 3 days, Pharaoh will release you from jail and you'll be restored to your position. Baker, your dream means that you are going to die in 3 days because of your offense to Pharaoh. Those dreams came true. He had said to the cupbearer, hey, when you get back to Pharaoh, put in a good word for me because I've been thrown in jail for no good reason. But the cupbearer forgot. He didn't forget for a day. He didn't forget for a week. He didn't forget for a month. He forgot for 2 years. There's Joseph still in jail. At least he was in charge of the jail. But he was in jail, an innocent man. But what caused him to take a next step was because Pharaoh had a couple of dreams, very disturbing dreams. He could not find anyone that could interpret those dreams for him. So that's when the cupbearer had the light bulb go off. Oh, I forgot to tell you this. There's this dude who interpreted my dream and the baker's dream, and he was completely accurate. His name is Joseph. You got to go see him. So he brings Joseph to him. Joseph interprets those dreams, saying, your dreams mean that there's going to be 7 years of great prosperity, and then there's going to be 7 years of severe, intense famine. If you're smart, Pharaoh, you will appoint someone to store away 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 years of prosperity so that you can feed your people during the 7 years of severe famine. Guess who Pharaoh appoints to do just that? Joseph. Daddy's boy, now Pharaoh's boy. He raises up in power once again. He is the right arm to Pharaoh, the leader of all of Egypt. And he does exactly that. He stores away all the grain that he can during the 7 years of great prosperity. Then the famine hit, and it was absolutely severe. So severe that not only were they having to sell grain to their own people, people from all over the world, from other nations, were coming to buy grain from Egypt. And one day, guess who shows up to Joseph asking to buy some grain? His brothers. And, nice little foreshadowing confirmed, they bowed down to him as they came. They didn't know it was him. They did not recognize him at all. And they came and they bowed down to him and said, please, we want to buy some grain. He recognizes them. This is a huge moment for him. He's emotional, but he's trying to keep his poker face, and he does that well. He ends up sort of questioning them. He has compassion upon them. Even though they were there to buy grain, they would stuff their sacks with grain, and he would order the people stuffing those sacks to put their money back in the sack. He didn't want them buying the grain. It was kind of freaking them out, actually. And he toyed with them a little bit to get information about their dad and about Benjamin. Benjamin was his only full-blooded brother in the family. The rest of them were half-brothers. So he was questioning about Benjamin. Benjamin, by the way, was the new favorite since Joseph was gone. Jacob thought Joseph was dead. So Benjamin was the new favorite. At one point, Joseph frames Benjamin. He says, if you come back, you have to bring Benjamin with you if you come back for more grain. They come back for more grain. They have to talk Jacob, the dad, into letting them bring Benjamin. They bring him, and what Joseph does is he makes sure a silver cup, chalice, ends up in his sack. Frames him for stealing. And the whole reason he did it is he sent people to go catch him. And they said, now Benjamin has to stay here as a slave to Joseph. He wanted to be with his brother. But one of the older brothers, Judah, steps up and gives this rousing speech. He says, if you take Benjamin, our father will die. His life is bound up in this child. He once had his favorite son, and now doesn't have that one anymore. And now this child is his favorite. And if he dies, if something happens to him, it will literally kill him. Please take me instead. Jesus says, please, let me be your slave. I'll be your slave. Don't take Benjamin. And that's where we take up Genesis 45:1. It says Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, out, all of you. So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. Then he broke down and wept. He wept so loudly the Egyptians could hear him, and word of it quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. And then listen what he says next. But don't be upset. And don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Now listen. How many of us would have said, come closer, let me tell you something. Na-na-na-na, boo-boo. You want some grain, where are you going to get it? I guess I could give you some, but I don't know. Throw me in a well? Sell me into slavery? No, he says, don't be mad at yourselves, because it was actually God who sent me here. Verse 6, this famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt, so come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, or you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and everything you own. I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise you, your household, and all your animals will starve. Then Joseph added, look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. He was still trying to convince them who he was. They were shocked. Go tell my father of my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything you have seen, and then bring my father here quickly. Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them, and after that they began talking freely with him. It's a crazy story. After all that Joseph went through, landing in a pit that he didn't put himself in, landing in a prison that he didn't deserve. And yet we find this great truth from Joseph's story, a truth that I hope you will take home with you today. And that is this: it's never too late to rise above. I don't care how long you've been enduring your storm. I don't care how long you've been in that pit or that prison that you didn't ask for, you didn't deserve. It's never too late to rise above that. And as I look at Joseph's life, I believe at some point he could have stopped and said, you know what, I give up. I'm just going to wallow in self-pity here, man. I mean, once he landed in jail after all the good he had done for Potiphar, it would have been really easy to say, you know, fine. I'm done. I'm done being a leader. I'm done using my gifts for God. And yet instead, he didn't do that. So I'm asking you, if you find yourself in a pit that you didn't put yourself in, I want you to know you can, with God's help, rise above that. If you're in a prison that you don't deserve, if you're facing circumstances that don't make any sense, that you can't find any reason why God is letting this happen to you, I want you to hear right here and right now, you can rise above. And one thing I've learned that helps me to kind of understand this, and it doesn't always make me feel good, but this is so true of God. God never wastes a pain. He never wastes it. How can God use the grief of a mom who only had her baby girl to hold for 8 days? I invite you to talk to Emily Lowe. How can God use your siblings ganging up on you, putting you in bad circumstances, being falsely accused of something you didn't do and put in jail for it for years? Talk to Joseph. How can God use the pain of divorce, grief, failure, depression, anxiety, bullying, disability, absent parents, abuse? Guess what, friends? You can look around you in this very room right now, and every single one of us are marked with pain. Past pain, perhaps present pain, and without a doubt, future pain. That one gets me, because I still don't know the tough time I'm going to go through soon or later or down the road, but it's going to happen. All around us are the stories of painful circumstances. But here's what God does. He takes your pain and He turns it into a passion that He will use for His purpose. One of our seniors who will be graduating from Simon Kenton soon, Brooke Willis, she's in the room right here actually. I will never forget her scheduling an appointment with me and bringing her mom with her, and she gave a presentation to me in my office. She presented to me that she experienced a lot of pain when her parents went through a divorce. And she realized after going to camp that she had a passion for helping other kids who have endured the same pain she had. And she discovered a way that God might be able to use that for His glory when there was a program she learned about called Divorce Care for Kids. So after this presentation she gave, she wanted to know if I could give her resources to help her start Divorce Care for Kids. It's like a dream when that happens to a pastor. Like, so you want to lead and do a ministry and you're following God's will and you have this passion, and it's like unbelievable. And that's exactly what's happened. For years, we've had Divorce Care for Kids. It's actually about to move off campus to the Y for the month of June. That's what God does. It seemed like it was not very long at all after Emily went through what she went through, still recovering from what she went through, where she exclaimed to me that a Muslim woman she had met way before, she was able to be Jesus to her as she endured the exact same circumstances that she was going through. Just being Jesus to her. Not that long ago, Emily got to speak in Washington, D.C. about what she's been through. And God takes our pain and turns it into a passion to use it for His purpose. It's just what He does. It don't always make sense. And we don't always want to hear it at first when we're in the midst of the painful circumstances. I love this Bible verse I want to read to you, Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. And when you hear that, if you're in the midst of the worst of the pain, you just want to say, well, I don't care if this hurts. That's what you want to say. But ultimately, this promise is true. It is true as true can be. I've seen it over and over again. That He will not waste our pain. And He will use it for His glory and for His purposes in us and in others. How do you rise above, though? How do you do that? I think it's very simple. Be faithful to God no matter the circumstances. Just be faithful to God no matter the circumstances. That's kind of a nice touchy-feely way to say it, but just continue to be the you that you are in Christ before those circumstances hit. Keep doing that. As I was thinking of Joseph, I had this weird little thought. I thought of LeBron James. If you're an NBA fan and a sports fan, you've probably heard of King LeBron James, one of the best basketball players ever to play. And I remember it was all a big hype. He was about to decide if he was going to stay in Cleveland or go to another team, and he had this big giant special on ESPN. They call it The Decision. And I remember him saying these words, "I'm going to take my talents to South Beach." Words that make people in Florida very happy. Words that made people in Cleveland start looting and burning jerseys. You know, it was horrible. But it was big news. And I thought about this. LeBron was saying, I'm taking my talents to South Beach. I'm just going to go do what I do in another place. And I know this may sound like a silly parallel, but that's what I think of when I think of Joseph. He was interpreting dreams before he went into the pit. But just because he went into a pit that he didn't ask for, that someone else put him in, he didn't stop interpreting dreams. He was a leader in Potiphar's house and ended up being thrown in jail. But just because he landed in prison, he didn't stop being a leader. He was a leader and he ended up being in charge of the jail. He was faithful where he was, even though where he was wasn't great. No matter the storm, no matter the pit, no matter the prison, no matter the circumstances, just be who you are in Christ. And I imagine it probably didn't get written in Genesis, but I bet Joseph had his days, his why God days, his days where he just wanted to stay in the corner of that jail and not be a leader because this seemed so unfair. I'm sure he had days like that, but man, his faithfulness, God used it. And here's what I've learned. You can't always control your circumstances, but you can always control you. Every time. And the truth is, if you live long enough, you're going to, the circumstances you can't control are going to pile up like a mountain around you. Can't do that. Can't control people, can't control their choices, can't control their mentality, can't control everything around you, man. The storms come and you don't have any way to stop it. But you can always control what you do about it. I would encourage you to do what I believe Joseph did. He kept worshiping. He kept praying. He kept obeying. He kept serving. He kept singing maybe. He kept doing him. He kept being a believer in God, a follower of God. For 2 years, Joseph rose above in his undeserved prison sentence. But in the end, you know what he did? This is crazy. When you think about it, now Jacob, God gave him another name. Do you remember? Does someone in here know the other name for Jacob? Israel. Israel. The name of the nation of Israel came from Jacob. That was the name God changed his name to. Do you realize if Joseph did not rise above, if he didn't rise above his circumstances, if he instead chose to just stay in that pit and wallow in self-pity and not cling to God still, if he had not done that, do you realize all of his family would have starved? There would be zero Israel. I mean, I believe that maybe God would have come up with another way. I don't know. But the truth is, God chose a man who would rise above his circumstances and remain faithful in unfair storms that came his way to preserve the nation of Israel, to preserve God's people. When you cling to a never-changing God during your ever-changing circumstances, He will use you to forever change a life. And don't think it's not true. I will tell you real quickly as we close one way that happened in my life. Really in my dad's life. I've sometimes shared my dad's story. I don't know if he likes me doing that, but I do it anyway. I like sharing his story. A tough circumstance that my parents went through was a divorce. And it's weird when you talk about how God can take a pain and use it for His purpose. I believe to this day that probably Dad wouldn't be a follower of Jesus Christ if it weren't for that painful divorce. But you'll never hear me saying, yay, divorce. So glad that happened to my parents. I don't say that, but God used it. But really, God started doing that work in him long before that, when my parents were still together. It was a diagnosis that we got for his mom, my grandmother, Carrie, Mama Carrie. Years before that divorce, she was diagnosed with cancer. Now, something interesting is that we only saw my grandmother once a year. And you know, I don't know if you've had this experience, but the older you get, you realize more about your family that you did not know and understand, and you're kind of like, whoa. I remember when I got my license, that meant I could go see my mama anytime I wanted to go see her. And when I made the first drive, it was only a mile away. I'm thinking, wait, we see Grandma once a year at Christmas Eve, and she lives a mile away. Well, that's when you start asking questions as an adult. You're like, oh, there's all this family drama, there's grudges, there's stuff happening, and that's why we don't get together as often as we do. But one thing I came to understand, I think one of the biggest reasons we didn't go there, is every single time we went there, oh, she was going to talk about Jesus. And it made my family squirm like crazy. So only once a year we would go there. But then when she got that diagnosis that she had cancer, my dad he stepped up big time. He would drive her to Vanderbilt University in Nashville, which from Harlan County is like going to Pluto. It was like a big deal. But he would take her on trips there, and he was involved. And I never will forget him telling me retrospectively that one of the biggest things that began to change him was watching Mama go through all that she went through. A saintly woman, a matriarch in her church, who is the last person you would think would ever deserve to go through what she was going through. Of all things, the cancer was in her throat, and she used that throat so powerfully for God. She taught every Sunday. She sang so hard every Sunday at that church. Why would God let this happen? And my dad was probably thinking, here's another proof about this God that people are trying to get me to follow. But instead of seeing someone who stayed wallowing in a pit, he saw this woman smiling, worshiping, clinging on to faith, obeying God, witnessing to her doctors and nurses, and glorifying God through the entire journey. And the one that got changed was my dad. You know how she changed a life? She just kept being faithful while she was sick. That's it. You don't have to get trained for that, guys. You just got to rise above. Even when you want to shake your fist, and we'll have days like that too. Even when you want to scream, not fair, God. Why? Even though those days will come too. At the end of the day, if you will choose to rise above and cling to your never-changing God in your ever-changing circumstances, oh, He will use you to forever change a life. Friends, I don't care how long you've been in the pit or prison you've been in or how many times you've gone there. I want you to hear loudly and clearly, as we've been saying for a month now, it's never too late. You are never too far gone to experience a comeback. But the choice is yours. Each and every time we gather together, I offer up next steps to consider. I would like to actually offer those next steps while we're praying. So if you do me a favor, I'd love for everybody in this room to just bow your head and close your eyes. And I want you to just get alone with God in the quietness of this moment. In just a moment, we're going to sing a closing worship song. But I want you to consider these prayers to perhaps offer to God as potentially the next step you must take in your journey. One of those prayers might be this: God, forgive me for abandoning you during my difficult circumstances. Because I will tell you this, there's nothing in the Word of God that says He would ever leave you during those storms. So if you're apart from God, it's us who moved. It's you who moved. And maybe your next step is to just come back to Him and say, God, with all that I've been through, I have just ran away from you. I've hidden from you. I've given you my cold shoulder. I've given you the silent treatment. I just can't be with you. I just can't talk to you because of what I've been through. And I know it needs to end. God, forgive me for doing that. Perhaps that's your next step, is to pray that prayer. Or maybe it's this: God, show me right now how I can be faithful to you in the midst of my circumstances. Tell me how. Show me something to do. For Joseph, it was to just keep being a leader, keep interpreting dreams, hold on to trust. I don't know what your next step is, but ask Him to show you that. Maybe He'll tell you to just keep believing, just keep waiting on me, just be patient, just know that I'm here. Even though you don't feel it, I'm here. Believe that. Ask Him to show you how to be faithful to Him in the midst of your circumstances. Maybe your next step is to pray this prayer: God, show me how my pain, give me a glimpse of how my pain can be used for your purpose. And maybe He won't answer that today. But if you're willing to learn that answer, in His time He will give it to you. Just like He did for Emily. Just like He did for Joseph, when Joseph had his ha-ha moment and realized, my brothers didn't send me here. God sent me here. Lastly, maybe your next step is to just pray these two words: God, help. I don't know what else to say. I just need you. All this stuff has happened in my life, and I desperately need you. And guys, I'm here to tell you, if you pray that prayer, the Bible says the hand of rescue will come, and He will save you, and He will redeem you in His time and in His way. But you've got to run to Him. Will you?